Gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Jacobs, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Secretary Blinken, for testifying today. I first want to talk about Sudan, where conditions are getting more horrific by the day. The RSF and SAF continue to encircle al-Fashir, where more than 1.8 million displaced people are trapped in what has been described as, quote, hell on earth, and is at imminent risk of famine. The UAE, a top buyer of U.S. arms, has continued to fuel this war by providing material support to the RSF, despite repeating urgings from the Biden administration, including, I know, your own entreaties. It's time, in my opinion, to take stronger action, which is why I'm introducing legislation that prohibits the transfer of U.S. arms to the UAE until the president can certify to Congress that the UAE is no longer transferring arms to the RSF. Now I want to turn to Israel. Hamas's attack on October 7th was despicable and inexcusable. And I've also been horrified by the Israeli military's response, which has reportedly killed over 30,000 Palestinians. So while I support President Biden's pause on the 2,000-pound bomb sales, I was also disappointed by NSM 20 report that laid out compelling evidence of law of war violations, but stopped short of making a conclusive determination. Meanwhile, we're seeing in recent reporting that in Rafah, the IDF has intensified airstrikes, deployed ground troops, and closed the Rafah border crossing. The UN has reported that over 500 civilians have already been killed and 450,000 Palestinians have been displaced. President Biden rightly drew a red line for U.S. support on a full-scale invasion of Rafah. But I think it's unclear to the public the difference between what we're seeing now and what would be crossing that red line. So could you explain the difference to us, please?
What we're seeing now is an operation principally designed to take control of the border area, or at least parts of the border area between Egypt and Gaza, in order that the smuggling, the tunnels that are there, are taken out of action. And I understand that objective. At the same time, because it's been near Rafah and around Rafah, it has disrupted operations at the Rafah crossing, which have been critical to getting aid into people who so desperately need it. It also, for a time, disrupted operations at Kerem Shalom, although those have resumed. So we're working intensely with Israel and Egypt right now to try to get Rafah up and running again so that more can get in. It's more challenging in a combat environment.
Yeah, well, thank you for that clarification, and I hope we hold firm to the red line that President Biden has enumerated. As you know, I'm the ranking member of the Africa Subcommittee. I frequently travel to the continent and talk about human rights issues, and I'll be honest, I've been hearing a lot from our African partners that the U.S. is not consistent in living up to our values, that they don't feel like we're a good partner because they perceive we're not holding Israel to the same standards that we're holding them to. In the NSM 20 report, our own intelligence community assessed that Israel could do more to avoid civilian harm. Could you talk about specifically what we are urging Israel to do to mitigate and avoid civilian harm that they aren't already doing?
There are very detailed processes, procedures, lawyers who engage, for example, in the targeting decisions. And we've looked at over many months at the details of what on paper they're doing, but we see a gap between the stated intent of the policy and the actual results. Now, it's also a fact that is not always recognized that they're dealing in an environment, in a terrain that is almost unique because you have an enemy that hides behind and hides underneath civilians in apartment buildings, in hospitals, in mosques, in schools. And that makes what they're doing incredibly challenging. But from our perspective, we think it's imperative that a priority be placed on civilian protection and on making every possible effort to try to ensure that even in that usually challenged environment, civilians are not harmed and, relatedly, get the assistance they need to survive.
Yeah, well, I agree with you, and I would hope the department is leveraging the intel community's assessment to urge Israel to do more because, frankly, not only human lives, but our international reputation depends on it. Lastly, the NSM 20 report said that they didn't reach an affirmative conclusion about Israel's use of U.S. weapons because Israel's failure to share complete information. How are we addressing this lack of transparency?
Well, there are two things in the report. One goes to the use of any weapons provided by the United States, and there, as the report noted, based on the totality of the damage done and the use of weapons, it's reasonable to assess that in some instances they acted in ways that were inconsistent with international humanitarian law. Those instances are all under investigation by us, but also critically by Israel itself. Separate from that is the provision of humanitarian assistance. And there, it's been important to get as much cooperation as possible on getting more access.
Thank you. Yield back.
Young lady yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizinga, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Blinken, appreciate you being here. But I do have to express